5 years ago, pre-COVID, sort of you were very, very kind and invited me to, sort of have a chat with you, and sort of I really appreciate, sort of, Guillermo, that you came in contact with me. The topic today, the title doesn't, as you're going to see, it doesn't quite capture it, but I spent the whole week trying to figure out what the title should be. And at the end of it, I thought, well, that's just going to have to do. But fundamentally, it's going to be about this problem of conscientious provision in healthcare. But it's actually a much bigger, in my view, sort of moral philosophical problem, although it had most of the discussion that I see at the moment is coming in bioethical circles. And so I hope we can, have a lovely dialogue, sort of about sort of the kinds of issues which are at stake here. I want to start with an acknowledgement of country. I think it's very, very important for this kind of talk. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera peoples on whose unceded territory this talk is happening. I'd like to recognize their elders past, present, and emerging. The country upon which they continue to exercise custodianship was seized from them unjustly. And I recognize that my capacity to speak here depends on those wrongs, and that they deserve restitution for them. All right, let's get started. I really want to emphasize, I'll talk about conscientious objection or conscientious refusal a bit, but nothing in this talk actually says what I think about conscientious objection, because I actually don't know. I spent a long time reading a lot of different stuff of it, but I still can't make up my mind, sort of exactly, how we should think, about that problem. The point is to, focus on what's called the symmetry debate in conscientious objection. And to show that sort of the problem that I'm really concerned with actually has nothing to do with conscientious objection. It's a very, very different kind of problem, and it requires a socioeconomic and a historical nuance, which, as far as I can see, is not in the literature so far. Because what most of the literature does is basically says they're the same, and then asks, how do we manage it? And I don't think that's true. All right, so here's an important quote, which I want to start with, which can help us to sort of provide some of that socioeconomic nuance. And this is from 2017. It was in the context of a youth suicide crisis in northwestern Ontario, where I was working as a clinical bioethicist at the time. And, sort of, you have similar kinds of phenomena here. You have these suicide clusters, which periodically hit certain communities. Not all of them, of course. Some communities are really, really thriving, but some of them are not. And one of the ones which has struggled is Kitchenmaid Kibasiba Nunavug, and Chief Cutfeet, was chief at the time of this. And notice what he says, quote, "The federal health system is designed to ensure that we remain sick and that our people continue to die. First Nations continue to suffer from the shrapnel of a foreign system opposed on us. This is the legacy of colonialism." Context of talking about why 10, 11, and 12-year-old kids are killing themselves. And the like. Now, of course, this is a Canadian example, but I've talked with some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends here, and you can cut and paste this for the Australian context, and it will work just as well. In terms of, many First Peoples experiences of healthcare, sort of in places like Australia or Canada. Now, that, of course, is about Indigenous peoples of various kinds, but there are other populations that are vulnerable to intentional harm by healthcare systems and by health workers who work within them. And I really want to focus on the intentional nature of the harms. And so, this is a really neat paper from 2022. The people who a state designates as terrorists, so what happens is, in some countries, there's been a blurring of the distinction between providing the care to people and providing material support for terrorists. And the consequence is that state agents, state violence agents, have been putting more and more pressure on healthcare workers not to provide basic healthcare to terrorists and the like, because of this blurring, because actually of, I think logically vague problems about what it is to be a terrorist in the first place. It's a hopeless word in my view. But also asylum seekers, a good one for Australia. Refugees, the unhoused is another population. One of my cases is, I've been thinking about a long time, and it's really about what you do with asylum seekers who are unhoused. Women seeking abortions will be another one. LGBTQI populations, racialized others, and in fact, any marginalized and oppressed population. Because, what I think, if I want to put in a nutshell what the waste or the mistakes, in the in the current discussions is they're not foregrounding the way in which privilege and oppression shape the decisional possibilities of healthcare workers and the, say, the resource allocation possibilities of institutions. And that in every single case, these are designed against the interests of certain populations. It's not an accident, it's deliberate. So, a couple of questions here. You know, and these questions for me foreground what the conscientious provision problem is. How do you function as a healthcare worker? Or, you know, for me, because I was working in this context, this is where I first really began to feel the reality of, you know, working in the colonial system. How do you provide healthcare without being a part of the bomb that he mentioned? If that's what our healthcare system is, and if I'm working in it as a bioethicist, how do I function in a way which actually supports those individuals rather than actually sort of continuing on the same kind of damage which he's describing? How do you provide care, if we want to generalize beyond the First Nations context, when the incentives of the socioeconomic system, you know, within which you're working, either deliberately or inadvertently, are designed against the interests of specific populations? What are you going to do if those are the people you're trying to care for? That's, for me, the heart of what's going on in conscientious provision. Or how do you provide competent healthcare? And so I mean things as literally as simple as making sure that you can give oxygen to somebody who's suffering severe breathing difficulties like acute rheumatic distress syndrome. When, for instance, and this is a real case, the nursing station that the woman presents at just happens to not be provided with oxygen canisters because the Canadian government cannot be bothered to make sure that the nursing station is properly funded. Now, oxygen is basic. But if you're a healthcare worker and she shows up and you want to help her, how do you do it? Basically, right? Or because we need to understand, and I want to focus on liberal states because it's easy to focus on the authoritarian ones. This is a problem of liberal states. And, you know, it's part of what I don't like about how the discussion in the literature is going, is it's just presuming the legitimacy of the liberal state when it's a much more complex problem than that, I believe. So healthcare systems reflect the interests of the people who design it. And again, think about Chief Cupfeat's comment, colonial system imposed upon us. By whose rules, by whose values is the system constructed? And so there are whole populations here and elsewhere in liberal states who are by design pushed to the edges or actually totally denied access to any healthcare. There are lots of healthcare workers who want to support those populations. And I hope you can see, I mean, I'll actually formally describe the dilemma shortly, but I hope you can see where I'm trying to take this. So in my view, you know, sort of how do you provide care, you know, sort of when you're not allowed to? It's another way you can ask the question. Is in my view, this is a central failure in contemporary discussions, is that they don't take oppression seriously. Some of them mention it, but it's not thematically foregrounded. And so some of the people who are, you know, supportive of conscientious provision, they're particularly worried about things like sort of abortion provision in, you know, in some of the US states right now. Very, very important, very legitimate content, sort of discussion. But one of the kinds of strategies they take is, all right, well, what we want to do is make sure that the laws change so we support the conscientious provisions of abortion. Would be just an example, right? Or we restructure our professional organizations so that they, you know, sort of are more supportive of people who want to conscientiously provide. I don't think that will work for a whole bunch of reasons, as we'll get into it. But anyway, you know, ultimately, you know, sort of I really want us as a bioethical community to become a bit more reflexive at the meta-political, philosophical level, and not just take for granted the laws and the healthcare institutions and the policies and the decisions about resource allocation that shape our communities. If you do, and if you work in a First Nations context, all you're going to do is, it's very, very obvious, by the way, you know, sort of, it's not a subtle problem in that context. It's literally, they sort of say, here's what I want, here's what we need. You say, I can't do it. And the thing they need, you know, is something that's really, really obvious, very simple. But you can't do it because you're not allowed to do it. And so what do you do? And so this is a problem of liberal states. So I want to focus on Canada. You know, my examples today will be Canadian, but you're all Australian, or many of you are Australian, you will find very, very easily equivalent Australian examples. Just invite you to sort of go looking for them. All right, so let's have a case one. And I've been thinking about this one for a long time. And I think it's a really, really important case. It's from Toronto. And so Dr. Wong, in 2004 to 2009, he serves homeless and marginalized populations, especially asylum seekers, sort of refugees and the like, but also street people of different kinds. And one of the things he notices, which should be blindingly obvious to all of us, is actually their most fundamental problem is they're malnourished. They don't get adequate calories for the day. So why are they getting sick and dying? Well, part of it's street violence, but part of it's also that they don't have food. And so what he realizes is that there's really cool programs, special dietary allowance program, which you can allocate, basically what amounts to 3,000 healthy calories a day per month, for people who qualify for the special dietary allowance program. But what Dr. Wong also knew was that none of his patients qualified for the program. So what did he do? He qualified them. So for 6 years, he filled out special dietary allowance forms fraudulently. And for 6 years, he provided high quality nutrients to that population until finally in 2009, there was a complaint from Doug Ford, who just happens to be the Conservative Prime Minister, Premier of Ontario right now, and his brother Rob Ford, mayor at the time, about so-called Robin Hood doctors. And so this became the Robin Hood doctor case, as it was talked about in the media. So what happens? He had to be caught because statistically it's going to become pretty obvious, isn't it? That if you're just writing, masses of these things, then, doctor here, sort of is filling out, say, 10 a month, and you're filling out 200, going to show up. So eventually he got caught. And it went to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. And they actually, I've read the reports, I read the disciplinary analysis, and it was kind of funny to watch, right? Because they got 4 expert witnesses. 2 of them wanted him jailed on the spot and thought he was a fraud, thought he had no personal integrity, sort of a whole bunch of things. The other 2, they thought that this was the finest example of medical professionalism they'd ever seen in their lives. And it's really bizarre in the report, right? Because you can see that the disciplinary committee couldn't figure out what to do about this. And so what they said was he was naive and that he showed a lack of professional integrity. But they don't argue it. It's really weird. It's just an assertion. So you got all of this documented evidence, all of these pros and cons. You got Dr. Wong's statements. You got, sort of the Ontario Health Insurance Program's representatives talking about the fraud. At no point did he ever dispute that there was a fraud. It was the one most obvious thing possible, right? But anyway, so at the end of it, they couldn't, I don't know why, but they didn't reach the conclusions that the 2 more conservative doctors had reached, that he should just go to jail. But they also didn't reach his conclusion, which was basically Socrates, which is that actually you shouldn't find me at all. Sort of think Leopology, right? It wasn't that far. He wasn't self-consciously doing it, but it wasn't that far off of it. What they did was they ended up in this weird, chaotic middle ground, sort of saying, right, we have to do something. So they fined him $60,000. They suspended his right to practice for 6 months, so he wasn't allowed to work for 6 months. And the last thing they did was made him take a course of medical record keeping, which I thought was the funniest thing, since he knew how to do his documentation, right? That was never the issue. All right. So notice the background, by the way, again, socioeconomic nuance. There's no point in looking at people's behavior without thinking about the context, the privilege oppression context in which they're working. And this was in the background of 10 years of really ugly austerity work on the part of multiple Ontario governments, where the conditions of poor people are just getting worse and worse and worse all the time, which means that, of course, more people are dying and more people are experiencing unnecessary morbidity and mortality all the time. All right, that's one case. This is a different kind of case, but it's important as well. Now, this is Dr. Brenda Steinnagel, and so she works, assessing insurance claims for workplace safety, basically, workplace safety insurance board, as you can see. And this is at a time when there's a lot of pressure being put upon sort of the different organizations to cut their costs. Again, notice it's all around the same time, a little bit later in this case, but, sort of in terms of the austerity problems, the same forces are in play. And so what the specific company that she's working for, under pressure from the WSIB, starts trying to force her to do is to basically falsify her assessments. And so, Damien, imagine you got some brain injury, like the acquired brain injury that was in the real case. Basically, I'm the doctor. I know that you've got a very, very serious medical condition, but that what they're telling me to do is to write a false report about you so that you don't get the benefits. Anyway, she refused and she was fired for doing so. Of course, there was a lawsuit. Hold on. And just want to mention, so when the Ontario Federation of Labor, sort of supported her in the lawsuit, notice that what she's arguing, these government agencies and the economic interests that underlie them are deliberately doing from a healthcare point of view, acting regularly to harm, again, notice these are poor people. These are workers. These are not sort of people who are strongly empowered in the system. Sort of failing to heed medical advice. So, again, I'm the doctor. I sort of say, you need another year of recovery. You need all of these expensive healthcare services. And what happens is, WSIB says, nope, not going to get it. Doesn't matter what the medical advice says. Providing insufficient treatment, framing in pre-existing conditions for ongoing illnesses, independent reviewers. By the way, this happens in the First Nations context in a really ugly way at home too, if you want to ask me about it later. That proclaim patients to be healed in spite of the evidence of treating practitioners. So notice, getting a false, an unprofessional medical review from an independent medical doctor to use as a justification for not providing services. And then, of course, this is Dr. Steinnagel's problem, putting pressure on doctors to change medical advice. And then last, the federal government of Canada, in its infinite mercy in 2012, decided that it wanted to cut funding to some of its healthcare programs, one of which was the elimination of all funding for even medically necessary emergency care for asylum seekers and refugees. Okay? So very, very harsh law by any standard. So if I have a heart attack and I'm an asylum seeker, I'm not entitled to have life-saving care under that legislation. Now, this one was, the most egregious of the lot. And so enough, but not all, of course, enough members of the Canadian medical and healthcare community rebelled against this. And so what they started doing was just saying, to hell with it, I'm going to provide the care anyway. Now, they had to play fast and loose with budgets, and they had to do actually the same kinds of things that Dr. Wong was doing, right? But they did it at a collective level. Because if they didn't do it, then people were getting sick and dying unnecessarily. Not because of the competence or lack of competence of the doctors, but because they weren't allowed to provide and do their jobs. Okay. So I really want to draw our attention to this because for me, we don't understand conscientious provision if we don't understand this stuff. In each case, the problem arises because of either formal state pressure, or in the Dr. Steinagel case, it's informal. So it doesn't matter what the law is. You have this background, enormous pressure to cut costs. And so whether the law is explicitly saying no, as in the Harper government legislation, or as in Dr. Wong's case, or whether the law says actually they're entitled to this stuff, but people aren't allowing the law to be applied, either way, you have this very, very strong institutional violence. In fact, working on the healthcare worker to make them the agent of the denial of care. Because after all, remember, that person comes to me if I'm the nurse. And they ask me for care, and I'm the one who says no. The people who design these systems, they're always at a clean arm's length from all of this mess. So two of the dilemmas, notice these are moral dilemmas, of course, they're driven by law. And one of them is driven by, sort of violation of laws, basically by exactly the same state-based institutions. And what it means is that I, as a bioethics ethicist, if I'm working in this context, and this was my daily reality in Northern Ontario, working in First Nations health, I am incentivized to harm the people that I'm trying to support. The game requires me or tries to require me to do so. And I get rewarded to do so. How? Hey, I get a cool paycheck. I get prestige. Hey, I work in First Nations of Health. That's an undercurrent, in the current environment here and in Canada, that's a high-end thing. Oh, aren't you a great guy? But it's crap. Because if I'm following these norms, I'm actually making things worse for the people that I'm trying to serve. Because the institutions, Lost Health Canada, just as an example, the whole game is designed to harm these people. As Chief Cutfeet said, and that's what I saw. Again, I got tons of examples if you want to ask, sort of about specifics. So we're incentivized to harm. All right, so what's the asymmetry debate? Well, basically, it's the conscientious provision and conscientious objection are the same thing, and they needed to be handled by the same measures. And so if you think about what I've been talking about so far, and if you look at a standard definition of conscientious refusal like this one, I hope it'll become clear fairly quickly that there's something very, very different, in fact, about these. So in conscientious refusal, in states that permit it, it's the rights held by healthcare workers on grounds of conscience to refuse to provide a safe, legal, and professionally permissible form of healthcare to some individual or group. And so abortion, of course, is the most obvious example, but so is euthanasia, sterilization, emergency contraception, there's lots of different examples and the like. And, sort of as people are familiar with the debate know, this is what's called the conventional compromise. It's trying to balance the rights of people in the population to sort of safe healthcare against the moral integrity of the healthcare worker. And sort of for a couple of different features, the things which are refused, they're legal, sort of distributive justice permits them, the patient wants them, or the surrogate wants them, they're in the interest of patients. The healthcare worker knows how, they're properly trained to deliver the service, they're within the scope of practice, all of these things. So, these are things where that the intervention is safe, and where the intervention is beneficial, but the refuser is allowed to say no, because their conscience matters to them. Again, like I said at the beginning, this today is not an assessment of whether conscientious objection is a good thing or not. I'm just trying to show that it has nothing to do with conscientious provision. Now, note, and this is a dark point, they can also involve refusals to treat whole classes of patients, for instance, LGBTQI and women. And it's one thing which worries me about liberalism, which is that it can be very, very thin in its analysis of the content of people's beliefs. And so this is a kind of a case where that thinness emerges because people are allowed to believe what they want. And as long as they don't harm other people, whatever that means, they can do it. But in a case like this, they're, in specific states like Florida, which is the archetype, the worst case, as you can see in the following quote, the racist or the sexist, misogynist beliefs of people in this case are allowed to become part of the law. So you're allowed to actually allow someone to die in Florida right now because you believe that they're LGBTQI. Transgendered would be the most obvious target in the Florida context. So, protection of medical conscience. All right, so notice it's about protecting the healthcare worker. Now, what are the aims? Preserve the moral integrity, avoid and manage moral distress. Moral distress is a very, very significant problem, so I don't want to downplay this in any way. But notice what it does. It removes legal penalties associated with the refusal to provide care, which means that it removes the dilemma as a moral dilemma for anybody who's working in a state where that sort of practice intervention is the right to refuse that intervention is permitted. And what it does then is it puts the refuser into an oppositional relationship with their patient. Okay, why? Through the intentional. Notice it is intentional, right? Denial of their desires and of their choices. And so it's an expression of the systemic power of the healthcare worker. Also, we need to think power all the time, even where the conscience is misogynist, racist, LGBTQI phobic or other. Because again, the laws are really thin about the content of people's beliefs and what they mean. And even though it's manifestly obvious that people suffer, for instance, with the denial of abortion services. Now, conscientious provision, notice, refers to cases where also on grounds of conscience, the healthcare worker provide care to patients otherwise denied it by law, policy, economics, resource allocation, or the individual choices of others. There's lots of ways in which you can play out. And they're not protected in law. Now, one of the goals in the symmetry debate, which I think is misleading, which will never ever work, is to protect conscientious provisions for people who are, because they see the power of the moral argument that it's wrong to deny people care on grounds of their group membership, but they think that it's possible to, sort of create a legal case for this. And the vacuousness of that belief, in my view, is obvious from the idea of, sort of providing a right to conscientiously provide abortion in Texas or Florida or Georgia right now. Because if that right to provide that abortion is given, then every single abortion provider in the state will start working, right? Which means that there is no prohibition abortion. And so, so the idea that any state with a misogynist law like the anti-transgender and women abortion laws in Texas and Florida and places like this, the idea that any of these would put a conscientious provision right. I mean, in effect, it's a right to violate law. And what state's going to do that? Right? And so what's the error? Again, I've already said this, but it's the failure to situate the problem of conscientious provision in the socioeconomic realities of people's lives, which is in terms of the relationships intersectionally understood of privilege and oppression as they determine who gets access to what and who's denied access to what. And in this case, we're talking about healthcare goods. And so the symmetry debate just doesn't work because, it's sociologically abstract, in my view. So it's just not going to help us. And then the value of the Dr. Wong case, or the Stein-Nagel case, or the Canadian Medical Association Community case, or those wonderful healthcare workers in 2015 who signed that document the minute the border force law was passed that we're going to break that law because they're doing the same thing. The value of those real cases is they actually show you that once the socioeconomic realities are in place, there's nothing in common other than the word conscience. That's it. Because you only see the moral dilemmas when you see the situation in which people are operating. By the way, notice I'm not actually defending any specific case. It's probably obvious where my sympathies lie, but my goal is not to say that Dr. Wong was right or wrong. We need to understand what the problem is, and I don't think we do right now. So conscientious providers act when they perceive existing laws, informal distributions of power, resource allocation or whatever to be malign and to require them to work against patients' interests. And so their position is very different, notice again, from the refuser because they see themselves as allies. And if you know the social justice literature and allyship, that's the sense of ally that I have in mind here. People are acting to try and open up space for the expression of power by people who are denied it systemically. And so, there's no conflict between the moral integrity of the healthcare worker and the well-being of patients in conscientious provision in the way in which there is essentially in conscientious objection or conscientious refusal. In fact, they align, although it can be done poorly. And of course, if you do it poorly, then you're going to stuff things up for the people you're trying to support. But the intention is still to promote the benefit of people who are denied access to important healthcare goods. And so notice the difference, right? The nature of the oppositions are dramatically different. The opposition in a refuser case is to patients, to a class of patients. The opposition in the provision case is to the state. It's to capitalism, things like that, depending, again, on context, depending on how racism or misogyny or all these other things play out in the decision-making. So, there's a kind of objection you sometimes get, which is not very valuable, which is, that sort of, yeah, these are real problems, but, what needs to happen is legislative change. Because we're in a democracy, we're in a liberal democracy, sort of laws are formed by consensus, sort of, all of the basic principles that are supposedly drive our society. And that if you have, the situation like Dr. Wong faced, then actually what you need to do is work electorally to sort of change the law. Okay. One, there's little guarantee. There's no reason to believe it will work that way. But more importantly, the person who's starving is now. And legislative change is how many years? Or in the case of the Harper government's denial of medical care, that person's having a heart attack and they're dying now. And okay, I'm not going to help them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the Ontario legislature and I'm going to start, I'll hold a little bit of a rally and, sort of we'll work for legislative change, which may or may not happen. They're dead. That person's sick. That person's dead. That person's sick. That person's injury hasn't been treated. All the while, sort of somebody, sort of says what people should be doing is, working for a legislative or systemic change. And so for the conscientious provider, they're motivated by that sense of compelling need. It's all very well, but you have one person, you have one other, take a Levinasian kind of category, you have one face of the other right in front of you, and that person's in desperate need now. So there's your moral dilemma. Do you follow the law or do you break it? Because if I say no, guess who's doing the killing of that person? Again, that heart attack right here in front of me now. I'm a doctor, I have all the skills, or a nurse, I have all the skills to save that person's life. Who's killing him? Me. Even though my decision is systemically mandated in various cases. In the end, I become the proximal agent of the death or the unnecessary suffering of another human being. And by any standard account of morality that I can think of, that makes me morally responsible for it. Some healthcare workers don't provide the care, right? Some do. The conscientious provider is a person who feels they have no choice morally. They're driven by the necessity of their sense of themselves as a moral agent to act in that case, to resolve the moral dilemma. And again, it's crazy, but, there's no possible compromise in the in the way in which there's a conventional compromise in the conscientious objection case. Because a conventional compromise is a legislated decision to allow a certain group of people to refuse to do that, whatever that is, while allowing other people to do the same thing, sort of again on grounds of conscience. But in this case, there's no compromise because what I'm being asked to do is kill someone, basically, when I have the means to save them. And the reason I'm being asked to kill them is basically because somebody wants to make sure the money shifts this way. It is ultimately all about capitalism. In the end, and the state just sort of functions as an enabler of all this. So we'll notice, and we all know this, conscientious objection is legal in Australia, legal in Queensland, for a whole bunch of different things. Conscientious provision isn't. Conscientious providers always have to sneak around. And so, I remember hearing a lovely case a few years ago, that related to the asylum seeker debate of an infant who ended up in one of the hospitals in Brisbane. I can't remember which one it was. But, the infant had been on Manus and Noro, or one of the concentration camps out there, and was flown in for medical treatment. And the healthcare unit kept lying about the infant being well enough to go back. That's conscientious provision, right? Lots and lots of different contexts. So, by the way, how am I doing for time?
I think that you have 10 more minutes.
Oh, so? Perfect. Well,
okay?
Yeah. Feel free to just stop me or let me go. Okay. If I drone on for too long. But sort of another thing you notice, another important difference, and this is talked about in the literature very, very usefully, is that conscientious refusal has no risk element where it's legally permitted. It only has a risk element where it's not. So if you're in Finland and you want to refuse to provide abortions, you take a risk, but you don't here. because you're legally allowed not to. But CP, in all cases, no matter what level of extremity you work to, always involves taking a risk. And the risk is very, very concrete. You could lose your job. You could be fined. You could go to jail. You know, that healthcare unit, you know, at that hospital in Brisbane, they did take that level of risk. They were playing fast and loose with healthcare categories, and they were obviously supported quietly by a lot of other people, you know, which, you know, one lesson in all this is you want collective action if you can get it, but Dr. Wong couldn't get it. And the reason is that conscientious refusals in states that permit them never challenges any privilege relation, ever. In fact, it embeds a certain privilege oppression relation, usually, not always. And so, you know, by its nature, you're talking about sort of the kinds of choices for healthcare workers where they're challenged by the state of reality of, you know, economics and law and put into these choices. And the truth is, every single one of us is, you know, who's a healthcare worker is challenged by these choices, no matter what your role is, whether you're a bioethicist or a health administrator or a nurse or a social worker, whatever, it doesn't matter. You know, if you're trying to provide care under these conditions, and if those are the populations you're trying to support, then you're going to be in conscientious provision dilemmas, and you're going to be taking risks of various kinds. The other thing, another way which you can understand the difference is that conscientious refusal, you may notice, is always issue-based. So it's refusal to abortion, refusal to emergency contraception, in terms of the legislative feature of it. It's refusal to, you know, forced sterilization, you know, sort of those kinds of things. I'm not in favor of forced sterilization, you know, which is one of the reasons why I'm a bit ambivalent about conscientious objection. I think it's very complicated. But CP is not issue-based. It can be. So there are, like the Jane Collective. Anybody know who the Jane Collective was? They were awesome. 1960s group of women who organized abortion services illegally for women in like Michigan and Chicago and Illinois and places like that. Just an incredible group of women. They enlisted the aid of gynecologists to teach them how to provide abortions. And, you know, that just before Roe versus Wade, so for about a 12-year period, a bunch of them went to jail. Of course, notice there's a risk. You run a risk. So it can be about issues, but most of it has nothing to do with issues. Most of it is so mundane that it's, it shocks your mind. And so it can be about things like, you know, a doctor friend of mine back in Northern Ontario, he wrote a set of referrals for 17 kids to go to Thunder Bay for medically necessary pediatric care. And he got a response back saying, no, just no. No justification, no explanation, no name of anybody who had actually done a refusal. Now, if it was a doctor, they should have been fired, should have lost their license on the spot. If it wasn't a doctor, then who was it, right? But so that what happens is, you know, sort of, you assume that a GP who spends a lot of time working in the communities has some understanding of the realities of people's lives and some understanding of what their health is. And then you have a set of decision makers, whoever the hell they are, because they're usually unidentifiable, who just say no. And you're trying to provide care to them. That's your conscientious provision thing. And so people like my friend, you know, sort of, they face things like, well, should I lie? Just like Dr. Wong. You know, will I inflate their condition to try and undermine the probability that some Health Canada bureaucrat's going to say just no, and the like. And so, you know, it's so mundane, you know, food. Can you get a vaccination for people who want it? You know, literally anything that you can imagine as the most ordinary healthcare, that gets denied to the populations that we're talking about. And so if you're a healthcare worker who wants to provide that good, however simple, however mundane, how do you do it when you're not allowed to? And I want to talk about this problem of incentivization. And by the way, this is an awesome essay by Sakina Herji from 2021, if you want to find it. It's just a wonderful updating of Marilyn Frye's great essay, Oppression, from like 88 or 89 or whenever it was, can't remember the exact date anymore. But she does this incredible analysis, sort of oppression of the Frye style double bind, but in the context of an intersectional understanding of how oppression works. So it's a really, really great essay. And the quote, I should have put it in square quotes, sorry about that, or sorry, in quotation marks. Oppressive structures tend to incentivize complicity with oppressive norms. But these oppressive norms also are what control an oppressed person's access to various prudential goods. Now, what people don't talk about a lot is that the same structural violence that shapes the behavior of the oppressed individual also shapes me, but in a very, very different way. Because I'm also, as a bioethicist, incentivized to stuff the Anishinaabe. I have the same benefit structure, that I get rewarded for following the law. I get rewarded for acting according to the desires of the senior administrators of the hospitals that I was working at. I get prestige. So pay, prestige, nice life for my now 13-year-old kid. These are big social goods, provided I don't take a risk, provided I don't go, this is wrong, provided I don't look at all these healthcare institutions and outright say, this is racist and it's got to stop, provided I don't cheat in the providing of a benefit or whatever. It's lots of different ways in which the conscientious provision problem can occur, right? And so, this is the problem of the ally under conditions of oppression, is you have freedom in a way that oppressed groups don't, because there are positive options to you in a way in which a double bind never permits for people who are oppressed. But wow, it's kind of good to give in. It's safe. It's very safe. You'll never get fired for doing your job, ever. But think about what Chief Cutfeet's saying. Doing my job is what's killing his people. Doing my job is contributing to the suicides of those 10, 11, and 12-year-old kids. Right? So we face binds, more genuine moral dilemmas, but they're not, Frye-style double binds. And so just some conclusions. I think the time is not bad, actually.
It's good.
Yeah, okay. So I don't think bioethics has done a very good job, actually, with problems of privilege and oppression. And there has been good work, I'm not denying that. But partly, I think it's just a contingent historical fact that it emerged out of sort of presidential commissions in the United States in the 70s. And so it had a kind of a assumption about the legitimacy of the state right at the start, which then very, very powerfully shaped a lot of, by the way, pretty good work. So, the point's not to deny the value of sort of wonderful work on informed consent and all the usual kinds of moral, moral issues that we encounter, in bioethics, but nonetheless, it doesn't analyze this kind of stuff. And so one thing it doesn't notice is that who cares about informed consent if the population you're trying to serve can't access the thing in the first place? Or if the way in which they access it in the first place is so inequitable or so structured against them that it doesn't matter. I got a friend who's an elder, a lawkeeper in Northern Ontario. And, he was arrested once for poaching, believe it or not, even though they have a treaty right. So you can't, theoretically. It's like Dr. Steinhagel. It doesn't matter what the law says. What matters is how the power works. So anyway, this friend of mine was arrested for poaching. His guns were seized. Those of his followers, his young friends who he was supporting and teaching in terms of the ways and rituals of Anishinaabe life, they were seized as well, which threw all of them, by the way, into poverty. And he's talking with his defense lawyer, and the defense lawyer says, well, okay, here's how the law plays out. And Ralph said to him, I'm the law. He is. Again, that's why, by the way, I think these acknowledgements of country are really important, because they're actually acknowledgements of genocide and colonial violence, and about the way in which, sort of the imposition of law in its own right constitutes a fundamental problem of ethics and politics. So yeah, for this friend of mine, and I've got another elder who I used to work with a lot as well, it was constantly how's health law? How does it work? And by the way, they weren't worried about the content of Ontario's Healthcare Consent Act. They were worried about who exercises power. And from their point of view, it doesn't matter whether it's a beautifully written, beautifully conceived act. Who cares? It's still stuffing them. It's still forcing them to conform to a model which is not theirs. And again, you know, so this is how I understand some of the depths behind Chief Cutfeet's comment. So bioethics hasn't done a great job of thinking about this stuff. You know, for those of you who do bioethics, you know, sort of you should be able to, you know, I hope you can see what I'm talking about because you've read probably more of it than I have, even some of you. I'm a late arrival to bioethics, by the way, only about 2014. I was doing totally other things and then by some random accident ended up in it. But it's also not self-critical by and large about liberalism. And that lack of self-criticism is a problem because every liberal state is a colonial state. And every liberal state, in one form or another, excludes all of these different populations somehow, and therefore puts healthcare workers who want to support them in the moral dilemmas that we're talking about. There are countless numbers of conscientious provision cases. They happen all the time. But they only happen with marginalized populations. And, you know, in a lot of healthcare systems, for instance, private healthcare systems, guess what? There aren't any marginalized populations in private healthcare systems. There can't be, because the game is designed for user pays, which means those who can't pay, they don't even get in there. So you don't worry about conscientious provision, unless there is an interesting case. A Catholic private institution in the States back in like 2015 or whatever, you know, obviously had, you know, sort of a conscientious objection to policy to abortion, but one of their employees was a conscientious provider. And so that generated a really neat one, you know, because he just said, I don't care what my contract says, you know, and he provided abortions for as long as he could until he got fired. Of course, he got fired eventually. But, you know, notice there are interesting questions about whose conscience counts, right, in this debate. And if we take the symmetry approach to it, we don't see that actually it really matters whose conscience counts. It's a problem of state violence and capitalist violence, in my view. And we legitimize and make invisible that violence by not properly conceiving this issue. Which means, and you sort of see this, right? You know, sort of some people will say, well, the state has a responsibility to look after its citizens and asylum seekers can only take so many. And we need to think about resource allocation, you know, and so you get generated this argument for the denial of care for a population. That's asylum seekers, but you can do it for all of the others, you know, just in different ways. And as you legitimate it, it stops looking violent. Because so we stop noticing that the cops are involved. We stop noticing that the military is involved, that people are going to jail, that people are getting beaten formally or informally. They're either being beaten by state agents or they're suffering violence as a result of their lack of protection by state agents. And your healthcare worker who's trying to provide care to these people are sitting in that mess, in my view. And notice this is kind of a lesser evils reasoning. You know, and I hate lesser evils reasoning because lesser evils for who? Basically, who decides which evil counts? Again, it's, you know, it takes us back to this problem of whose conscience counts. Because for the person who's being denied care, they don't see their death as a lesser evil, right? But if I'm an uncritical healthcare worker who's not thinking about the complexity of the problem, and I'm thinking, what does the law say, and where's the money, and whatever, and that person in front of me, and then I go, oh, yeah, sorry, I can't help you. Well, they're dead. Right? A standard kind of appeal is to this claim about sort of fair democratic process. What privilege oppression thinking challenges is the very idea that there's any such thing for these populations. And certainly, for my friends in Northern Ontario, the idea that there's anything fair about the distribution of healthcare resources or about whose law is functioning And for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends who I've talked with here, you know, sort of they say the same thing. Whose fairness counts and the like, especially since the ill treatment and neglect is deliberate, right? Somebody has to make a decision not to do this. Some group of people has to make a decision that this law is going to look like that this policy is going to be written in this way, that those resources are going to be allocated like this. And it takes us back to this problem, whose interests? And for a conscientious provider, the interests are racist or sexist, misogynist, homophobic, take your pick. And so, you know, I'll stop here just with begging people to take anarchist and Marxist philosophy seriously in bioethics. You don't see a lot of references even to Marx. There's a little bit, but I actually did a lit search not, a year or two ago, just trying to find how often Marx's name is even mentioned. Pretty rare. I mean, it's not totally non-existent, but, Emma Goldman, not happening. And the insights that I think we need to understand this problem sit in those traditions and in critical race theory and post-colonial theory in those places. They don't sit anywhere in the liberal tradition. Thank you. That'll do for today.
I'm going to stop the recording 1 second.